Tunisia is often described as the only Arab revolution success story. 3 years after the uprising which brought down the dictator Zayn al-Abidine Ben Ali, the country is transitioning into a multi-party democracy.
The revolution didn't fail, it was definitely worth it, but the social and economic problems that have been there for 50 years won't be resolved in 3 years, and the most important thing is that unlike other countries we've avoided civil war.
But all is far from rosy in this North African nation. Unemployment is high, divisions between secularists and Islamic parties are acute, and a Takfiri security threat poses a persistent problem.
The
main question in Tunisia is how to achieve national reconciliation. How can the Islamists and the secularists accept each other in a democratic state and learn to live together without clashing?
On this week's In Focus, we're in Tunisia during the first round of the country's presidential elections to find out whether national reconciliation is possible or if the revolution has simply run out of steam. Three years after the revolution that kicked off the Arab Spring, there's a feeling of despondency and frustration here in Tunisia, a feeling that the fruits of the revolution really haven't begun to take shape. There are soaring prices, there are stagnant salaries. On top of that, there are about 1 million Libyans who fled the chaos in their country and put a strain on services here in Tunisia. Finally, there's a prospect of the secular bloc controlling the parliament and the presidency. And if that happens, some people say a return to Ben Ali type authoritarianism is imminent. Tunisia's president has limited powers in a political system dominated by parliament. Nevertheless, he's the commander of the armed forces. He sets foreign policy with the prime minister, he represents the state, and he ratifies treaties. Although 27 candidates ranging from nationalists and leftists to independents ran for president, only 2 had a realistic chance of winning. The incumbent president, Monsef Marzouki, is a secular human rights activist who governed for the last 3 years in coalition with the Islamic Ennahda party. The 69-year-old campaigned on the promise of greater justice and a decisive break with past authoritarian governments. Meanwhile, Beji Qaed Essebsi is the leader of the secular Nida Tunis coalition. Essebsi, whose party won the most seats in parliamentary elections in October, is 88 and held public office under both Ben Ali and independence leader Habib Bourguiba. He's based his appeal to voters on stability and experience, as well as a secular outlook. Tunisians are dubbing this the first free presidential election since the fall of Ben Ali in 2011. And as you can see behind me, there do seem to be a lot of voters here, although most of them do seem to be middle-aged and older voters rather than young ones. There's also a lot of security, and that's because Tunisian officials say they've received credible threats against the electoral process. But from the evidence of my own eyes and the reports I'm getting, it does seem as though Tunisians are taking these elections seriously and embracing them. The polling station we visited was in a poor district of Tunis, Hayat Tadammun, which is conservative and Islamic. Wherever we went, people complained to us about wages and unemployment, as well as a general lack of progress since the revolution.
During the last 3 years, we've had so many social and economic problems, but at least we know what these problems are and that they can be resolved. I voted for Mr. Marzouki because he has the experience having been president for the last 3 years. I'm really proud of my country today. We have given a democratic lesson to the whole world.
People are surviving here, but sometimes I ask myself for how long. We're facing many difficulties and our area has been forgotten by all the political parties. I just hope that the new era will be better for us if the next president is righteous.
Most people here seem to be voting for Monsef Marzouki, who's allied to the Islamic Ennahda party. The secular old guard Nida Tunis party didn't seem to have much traction here.
We just want a president who'll look out for the working class and the poor people here and who'll improve our lives.
I really fear for my kids when they go to school and walk in the streets. There's no security here, and I'm really afraid about who will attack them. We just want somebody who's righteous and who fears God.
Personally, I voted for Dr. Marzouki because the choice now is between a return to the old regime and the people who dominated Tunisia for 60 years and a democratic future. We're fed up of the old guard, and that's why I voted for someone who wants to put an end to that.
Later on during voting day, we travelled to a more well-to-do part of town to gauge the thoughts of Tunis's other half. The opinions we got here were almost the direct opposite of the first polling station we visited.
I voted for Mr. Essebsi because he's decent, upright man, and he'll do the best for this country.
But I'm telling you that these were free and fair elections, and for me it was an honor to take part in them.
Ennahda is the biggest problem we have, and we need to get rid of people who want to impose their version of religion on everyone else.
It may be a cliche, but like many other Arab countries, Tunisia seems to be a divided nation, broadly converging around two camps, an Islamic and a secular one. These divisions always become particularly clear at election time. Tunisia's tourism industry is one of the country's biggest money spinners. With beautiful beaches, year-round sunshine and numerous historical attractions, tourists from Europe especially come in their droves. But with that comes a cost. With alcohol freely available and less than conservative dress on the beaches, many Tunisians consider the industry an affront to national dignity. It's an ongoing issue in Tunisia between the liberal-conservative divide. When people talk about Tunisia, they often remark on the divide between the more Islamic parts of the country and the more secular parts. We're here in Hammamet, which is a big beach resort. Lots of European tourists come here. Perhaps this place symbolises the more secular, liberal part of the country. And therefore it's not so surprising that Nida Tunis has chosen this as a venue to hold one of its biggest pre-election rallies. On the eve of the first round of the presidential election, this almost felt like a victory rally for the main secular bloc in Tunisia, Nida Tunis. The party, which is rumoured to be supported by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, is a sometimes awkward coalition between members of the old regime recast as nationalists, leftists and others. They seem to have temporarily at least come together with one aim: to defeat the Islamic parties.
I support Mr. Essebsi because he has a program to help young people here in Tunisia. I'm also sure that he'll help us solve the terrorism problem that we have.
Mr. Essebsi will look out for the youth and solve our problems. We need someone who'll unite all the political factions in the country, and he's that man.
As speaker after speaker received a rapturous welcome, they slammed Ennahda's record in government. They promised a return to law, order and stability, and they pledged to defeat the scourge of terrorism.
Our number one challenge and priority is to help the great young people of Tunisia live in dignity, and that's what we will do.
The mood at this rally was undeniably triumphant. But doubts still remain over how the secular bloc will deal with the country's Islamic politicians and activists, as well as the media, should they come to dominate all the main levers of the state. There are parts of the Tunisian capital which look more like Europe than the Arab world or Africa. French is widely spoken, European dress is the norm, and cafe culture reigns supreme. These are the strongholds of Tunisia's westernized liberal secular elite, the stronghold of Nida Tunis voters.
نداء تونس هو حزب جديد.
Nida Tunis is a new party, and everyone who's angry with Ennahda seems to be with them. It's not a real party yet. It's just establishing itself. Different groups from the left, the liberals, and the old guard are with Nida Tunis, and some of them have real experience and understand the problems of the state.
Salahuddin Joshi is a journalist and political analyst. He told me that Nida Tunis will face the same problems that Ennahda faced when in power, improving the economy, facing down the Takfiri security threat, and achieving national reconciliation.
يعني هما أنتي نهضة.
Nida Tunis are against Ennahda, but they can't afford to ignore Ennahda because the electoral difference between the two parties is not that great. So the question is, how will Nida Tunis deal with Ennahda and their supporters? Will they deal with them democratically?
Tunisia may have its ardent secularists, but we should still basically remember that this is a deeply conservative Islamic country. And the Islamic parties may have lost ground in recent elections, but they still have huge popular support and are deeply embedded in the population. The main Islamic party in this country is Ennahda, which is often described as moderate, and it's a party which has reconciled itself with a democratic secular state, and it's often criticized by fellow Islamist parties for making too many compromises. Tunis used to be one of the wealthiest and greatest cities in the Islamic world. Some 700 monuments, including palaces, mosques, mausoleums, madrasas and fountains, testify to its remarkable past. Around 98% of Tunisia's population are Sunni Muslims, which means that the country has avoided the sectarian tensions of elsewhere. Tunisian Islam is also heavily influenced by Sufism, while the government controls and subsidizes mosques and pays the salaries of prayer leaders. Tunis Medina, meanwhile, isn't just a tourist attraction, it's a living organism, the commercial and economic center for northern Tunisia. But like elsewhere in the country, the same economic problems blight its residents and workers.
We didn't gain anything from a revolution which was supposed to be about our dignity. No jobs were created, and life is very expensive now. I need to put food on the table because I have 6 sisters, but I can't provide for them. The new government must help us because life is too difficult here.
This country is going downhill. I'm a jewelry maker and I'm not selling anything. The jewelry and gold market in the Medina closes at 5 p.m. when we used to close at 7:30 p.m. because of security reasons. There are about 500 shops worth millions of dinars here, but you can't even make 10,000 dinars because nobody is selling. We need a president who will use force, a strong man.
The Ennahda party is the most powerful Islamic force in Tunisia. Emerging in the 1980s under Rashid Ghannouchi, its leaders were forced into exile and the party's activities were forced underground by the Ben Ali regime. But in the first elections following Ben Ali's ouster in 2011, Ennahda won 37% of the national vote and 40% of the parliamentary seats. Often described by the Western media as moderate Islamist, Ennahda believes in a greater role for Islam in public life, but also remains committed to personal freedoms, economic liberalism and good relations with the West. It also has very close ties to the state of Qatar and Al Jazeera TV station. For 3 years, Ennahda governed the country in coalition with 2 small secular parties. But in parliamentary elections in October 2014, it saw its percentage of the vote decrease to 27% and became only the second biggest party in parliament, behind Nida Tunis.
When we were in power, we tried to avoid dividing the country into Islamists and non-Islamist camps. We are a civil, democratic party, and we behaved responsibly and saved Tunisia from going down the route of civil war. Also, we never promised to solve all the social and economic problems here which have existed for 50 years in a 3-year period. Instead, we promised to safeguard the revolutionary process and maintain peace and a national consensus from the middle ground, and that's what we did.
The Ennahda party didn't field or endorse a candidate in the presidential elections. They say they took this decision as part of their consensus-based strategy to put national unity above party interest.
Nida Tunis and Ennahda have a large majority in parliament. This is the message of the voters, and Nida Tunis must recognise that. Tunisians want cooperation between the two major parties, and that's why we are proposing a government of national unity. We have big challenges ahead of us, and no one party can govern on their own. Nida Tunis needs to behave responsibly, otherwise the next 5 years will be lost.
Ennahda's time in power was more negative than positive. They weren't ready for power, and they wanted to dominate the government by creating a false coalition with some small secular parties which had little popular support. Ennahda had no programme. They just had slogans which they used when they were in opposition. And that's why they lost a third of their voters in recent parliamentary elections.
Although Tunisia is an overwhelmingly moderate Islamic country, the influence of a more conservative Salafi brand of Islam is also felt here. Most Tunisian Salafis have accepted the authority of the state, but some, widely known as Takfiris, have taken up arms against it. The Takfiris believe that those who don't follow their thinking are kuffar or infidels, and they've attempted to impose their will by force. Moreover, some Tunisians have blamed Ennahda for letting the Takfiris run riot, a charge they reject.
Ennahda tried to dialogue with the Takfiris at the start. They also let them take over several mosques for and allowed this Takfiri phenomenon, which is funded by Persian Gulf countries of course, to grow. But then Ennahda moved into open conflict with them after the Takfiris attacked the US Embassy in Tunis in 2013 and when opposition politicians were assassinated by them.
The Takfiris are a danger to the whole world, and this phenomenon is now everywhere, in Iraq, Syria, Mali and Nigeria for example. Terrorists and extremists just use religion as a vehicle to attack the state. We waged a war against them when we were in power. The next government must prioritize this fight against terrorism.
Tunisia is flanked by Algeria and Libya, two countries with active extremist groups that have pledged allegiance to ISIL. It's estimated that around 3,000 Tunisians have embarked on so-called jihads in Libya, Iraq and Syria, something people across the spectrum of Tunisian society consider a major problem. But whatever the attitude may have been in the past, there now seems to be a zero-tolerance attitude by the powers that be in Tunisia towards the Takfiri trend, and a determination to deal with them militarily.
It's vital that we fight terrorism just like other countries are doing. But we have to admit that the war on terror has failed up to now. Even when we defeat the terrorists, we just seem to displace the terrorism to somewhere else. There's no real project to fight terrorism, and we need one.
Tunisia has a rich tradition of religious reform, but Takfiris say the state itself is illegitimate. Some of them have taken up arms, and not just in Tunisia, but elsewhere in the Arab and Islamic world. But I believe this is a temporary phenomenon, because they depend on a certain social and political climate.
So we've come to Bizerte, which is about an hour north of Tunis, just to get a flavour of what people outside the capital think about politics. Now, Bizerte is a town which is known for its liberal culture, but like all the other major towns in Tunisia, it also has its Islamist, conservative-leaning areas. In fact, the Tunisian state came in militarily into Bizerte last year just to repress what they called a challenge to their authority by Takfiri extremists. We've also come to Bizerte to concentrate specifically on young people, because it's them that seem to have boycotted this presidential election en masse. Although over 60% of Tunisians voted in the presidential elections, virtually all observers noted the absence of young people. Youths were at the forefront of demonstrations which overthrew Ben Ali 3 years ago. So the question is, why have they seemingly abandoned the political process now? We pounded the streets of Bizerte to find out.
I didn't vote because none of the politicians represent me. I'm not against any of the candidates, but I refuse to vote for them too.
I didn't vote because I'm not interested in politics. Tunisians aren't made for politics. I don't trust the candidates because they all steal. They didn't give me anything, so I won't give them my voice now. I just don't understand how people who claim to be intelligent can give those they ousted from power during the revolution the opportunity to return to power. This is a circus. It's abnormal. Young people made the revolution, but old men aged between 80 and 88 are ruling us.
I didn't register to vote, and I don't trust any of the candidates. Had I registered, I would have probably voted for Mr. Essebsi. He's the least worst, I suppose.
So for Tunisia's next generation, revolution fatigue seems to have set in. Rapid change hasn't happened, and the young are noted for their lack of patience. They had high expectations following the revolution, which was sparked by their frustration with unemployment, economic marginalisation, and lack of social and political freedoms. But now they feel that their revolution has been stolen by political parties.
It's true that young people didn't participate in this election, although speaking for Ennahda, we do have many young people working for us and on our election lists, but I think the low level of participation is in line with most other countries in the world.
While the majority of Tunisia's population is young, the political class is old, and sometimes very old. Moreover, for many young Tunisians, the ideological debate between the two poles, whether secular or Islamic, or old regime versus new, is increasingly irrelevant. Whoever's in power, they just want social justice and more job opportunities.
I'm 17, but I won't vote even when I have the right to. I don't care about the elections. I just play football and have fun in my city. My parents are providing everything for me, but I'll leave this country when I grow up to work abroad.
I'm 16. You can see for yourself the situation in this country. We're just living an ordinary life. We eat and we sleep and we don't care about politics. I just study and play football. All politicians are just lying to us to get themselves elected. Politicians are just liars. They only have empty promises.
In the end, the two favourites did indeed come out on top. Beji Qaid Essebsi of Nida Tunis came first with 39% of the vote, ahead of current President Monsef Marzouki on 33%. This means that the presidential election will go to a runoff on December the 28th, because no candidate secured an overall majority in the first round. The vote was widely praised by observers as free and transparent, a major milestone in Tunisia's democratic transition. In the second round, it's widely expected that Essebsi will win. So if he does, what does the future hold for Tunisia?
The same problems that caused the revolution are still there now: unemployment, poverty, corruption, and regional disparities in wealth. After the revolution, we sorted out the political problems, but now we have to sort out the economic and social problems.
I think political Islam in Tunisia is going through a structural crisis and won't come back to power quickly unless it makes the necessary changes. If Nida Tunis improves the security and economic situation, the 30% that Ennahda won at the parliamentary elections will be further eroded.
I'm optimistic about the future, despite the challenges we face. Despite the big problems, Tunisia has a genuine chance to build a stable democratic society. It needs time, but we will get there, inshallah.
The essential question in Tunisia is one of national unity and how to achieve it. The secular parties and their offshoots and supporters in Tunisia have one vision of what this country should look like. And the Islamic parties and their supporters and constituents have another vision entirely. Now, Tunisia hasn't, thankfully, descended into the violence of Syria and Libya. But if that essential question, the reconciliation between Islamic and secular politics, isn't resolved, then it is conceivable that this country might go the way of its neighbours.